single Global Dev Communicators Connect with a moment of inspiration or something that has really stirred our soul recently. And we feel like that inspiration that we can share with each other is a part of reimagining global development. And we source this, we get it all in a doc so we can keep sharing and that inspiration. So Joanne, do you have something you want to share today to kick us off?
Yeah, just to welcome everyone in this space. We're so glad that you've made the time to be with us today. So for me, one of the things that I found really soul stirring this week is first of all reconnecting with a group of friends who live in Germany and in England, and we're sort of trying to create a space for mothers who are in between two different cultures, who are in between, for example, the Kenyan culture, which is where I'm from, but we're also living outside home, so just trying to create that space that has been a source of joy for me. And then through this group, I found out about someone on Instagram called Jeff Brown Soul Shaping, and his content has been really soul stirring for me. So I'm going to post that actually. No, we're going to add it onto the Google Doc, and then you'll be able to see that as well. So, like one of the posts this week was, about just remembering that you need to rest because the system is designed to keep you running on a hamster wheel. So just remembering to rest, how important that is and how it can fuel us towards claiming our own truth. Yeah.
Hear, hear. Thanks, Joanne. Speaking of oppressive systems, one of the reasons we ground ourselves at the beginning of every Healing Solidarity event is in recognition that part of that violence that's part of that is about disconnecting us from ourselves, from each other, from the land. And so we do take a moment of grounding at the beginning. And I'm gonna connect it with my soul stirring this month. I have been listening to a lot of YouTube videos of water bodies all around the world. And it is, so I'm just gonna give us 2 minutes of on the beach in the Dominican Republic, just for us to have a little bit of moment of escape before we begin. So just for 2 minutes, please join us at On the Beach. I love that the people just joining us probably hopped on a Zoom and was like, what is this? We were on the beach in the Dominican Republic to take a moment of grounding, and we're really glad to have you all here and joining us. So now it's time for you all to introduce yourselves. In the chat, just please go ahead and let us know who you are, where you are in the world, and what is a piece of writing or art or performance, anything that's stirring your soul recently. And feel free to share it here in the chat or put it in the Google Doc. Just always happy to hear where people are joining us from. So today we're going to take a minute to just talk about our objectives and our invitations for the hour together. As I said, we're really here to connect to each other and build a community where we feel supported in ushering in narrative change, knowing that that is often a very big change process within our organizations. Mm-hmm. And we're going to really just hear from Natalie today, who gives us a real recent and lived experience of this, and hopefully will get all of us thinking about how that works in our own organizations. And then we're going to harvest and share some of the wisdom and knowledge that's here. Part of this is sharing the ideas, the practical steps within this group, so that we really do shift from charity to solidarity in our work. So just a few ideas to guide us before we jump to learning from Natalie. There's just some invitations, we call them, as opposed to rules or norms or what have you. But it's a part of what we share is to make sure that this can be a space where we can show up as our full selves. And one of the ways we do that is to think about learning, not critique. We all have something to gain from interacting with each other today. This is a brave space, not necessarily a safe space. You are not promised to be unchallenged here. But we really want everyone to feel welcome, to go beyond their comfort zones. We will operate with consent. So everything we do is opt in and opt out. Feel free at any point to contact either Joanne or myself and let us know what your needs are. But we want to seek permission and not assume that you're here to do everything that we're doing all the time. Mm-hmm. We really try in this space to use I, not we. And that is a practice of making sure that we're speaking from our own experience rather than, again, assuming that one experience is everyone's experience. And we have all these differences based on all of our identities, and it's really important to not loop everyone into the we. And here's the most important part. The most important invitation for you all today is to dare to be unprepared. As communications professionals or as other kinds of professionals in the sector, we're so used to being precise and detailed and perfect. And we want here this to say that, you can be imperfect here and you can say it imperfectly and you can be authentic. That's actually really important to us. So dare to please to be unprepared in what you say. And of course, oops, ouch, I need to turn off the screen. I need to get water. I need to move. All those things to take care of yourself, please do so. So glad to have you all here. And now I'm going to turn to Joanne to introduce our special guest.
Natalie, we're so glad that you made the time to be with us today and to share, the very important work that you've started in your organization. So Natalie is the Advocacy and Engagement Manager in the Communications Department at the International Institute for Environment and Development, which is in the UK. She's based in London and inspired a lot by the shifts in the consciousness catalyzed by the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And she's been using basically narrative analysis tools to uncover and discuss like the different ways that racism is reproduced in organizational cultures. And Natalie moved into communications and advocacy work in the environmental and development sectors after many years of working in the activism in the British anti-racist movement. Her work has always been a remix of traditional takes on sustainability, aid, humanitarianism with cultural knowledge an insight drawn from her Jamaican and English heritage. She's worked for Greenpeace UK and International Action Against Hunger UK and Concern Worldwide UK. Natalie, thank you for being here, and we welcome you to this space to share with us your insights and the important work that you've been doing. We're all very keen because these are sort of like the next steps that a lot of organizations and a lot of us also as communications professionals are thinking, what next now that, you know, the truth is out. So welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm so pleased that I can be slightly unprepared and imperfect, because that's kind of how I roll at times. So it's really good to have that permission. Thank you so much.
Go ahead, Natalie. We'll just give you we'll give you time to share with us what you prepared, and we will be glad to pose questions as well. Jennifer, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're just going to use a Q&A format to learn about Natalie's experience and have her share it with us. So, and there will be time at the end for all of your questions as well. So thank you. So Natalie, before last year, you were developing, commissioning, putting out publications. That was a big part of what IIED did and what you were doing. But then last year, you really turned to exploring the narratives within and beneath those publications. And really, you were looking towards where does racism and white supremacy show up? So just tell us a little bit about that shift. What led you to that? What led you to be the leader of that? Yeah, just tell it. Just start from the beginning and tell us everything.
It's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, this project has probably been 20 years in the making. I hate to say that, but since I joined the environmental sector and then development sector, I've always been affronted and upset and angry and sad and disappointed about the way that Black people and people of colour are portrayed in the environmental and aid sector. And I've never really had the opportunity to explore that in a really systematic way with funding and a project. And the Black Lives Matter movement hit and just opened up that space where people in senior positions were willing to listen and to fund the work, essentially. Like in London, Black Lives Matter movement was great, but I was at home with a new baby. COVID was happening. And I just thought, this is not the time for me to hit the streets. I've done that so many times. I need to do something tangible in my workplace on this topic. And so I sold the idea into the chief executive with some support and encouragement from Jennifer. And then also to the comms director and our monitoring and evaluations team. And we actually ran this project as our annual internal evaluation, looking at ourselves. And so it meant it got huge buy-in and a kind of uptake in terms of staff engagement. You know, I literally, you know, had the ear of the whole organization.
Oh, I was so, and you know, captured by what you were saying. You know, I was waiting for more. But Natalie, what are some of the findings? You know, what are some of the racist worldviews or issues with dominant narratives that you uncovered in the process?
Yeah, so basically the way we ran the process was we commissioned a literature review, so worked with an academic who looked at what the literature says about racism in development narratives. From that, I suppose we worked with the staff. We identified 6 areas where we felt racism was being reproduced in narratives generally. Some were the usual suspects, so saviorism was there. Modernization theory, you know, this idea that you have to modernize African and South Asian countries, you know, majority Black countries, indigenous countries. So this idea that we had to modernize was there. The idea of neutrality, that actually you can apply goals, targets, standards to all countries as if they're equal, as if there are no political and economic underpinnings that make those targets impossible for some and easy for others. We had this dimension of exclusion, the fact that lots of the stories of what is traditionally seen as development work, so work on housing and education and health and food access, all those topics that we call development topics, actually the sector excludes the national efforts from, for example, liberation struggles or indigenous movements to do their own work on those topics outside of the development sector. And those stories, or even if it's the diaspora, for example, doing that work, those stories all get excluded from the development discourse. So that was one of the dimensions. But the most important one, I think, actually, was what I called colour blindness. This fact that the sector did not see race or racism. It wouldn't use language like white, black. It wouldn't refer to ethnicity. It wouldn't talk about slavery or colonialism. It wouldn't understand white privilege or anti-blackness. And so that colour blindness was also really central. So essentially the process was we had that literature review. We used it to develop a framework which included narrative analysis techniques that was asked, questions around identity and representation and function. How can a piece of content serve the institute, for example, or serve staff in the institute, or maybe serve the people who are being written about, who's benefiting most from this content. So it was a mixture of the narrative analysis techniques and those 6 dimensions that we used to actually assess content. We did it in small groups, just using samples, videos, blogs, that type of thing. But essentially what we found across the board was this issue of colour blindness was present every time. The sector just was not talking about the colonial history and heritage that leads in the main to extreme poverty. We weren't talking about racism between countries and how that contributes to extreme poverty. We weren't talking about white supremacy and how that contributes to extreme poverty, but how it also contributes to the development sector being led by the West. So that came up in every single piece of content, is colour blindness. We've definitely found that while we weren't an organisation that used traditional saviorism tropes and language, what we did do was, through the idea that we have knowledge that will empower you or help you, we were still bringing a very saviorism kind of energy and narrative and underpinnings to what we were saying. And what was interesting is the content, on the face of it, much of the content had quite progressive key messages in it, but these dimensions of racism were always sitting latent underneath in a much subtler way. But when you were looking for them and looking at the content across the piece, they became really apparent. IID always being centered, partners being marginalized, even the fact that we used the word partners so frequently. All of our content spoke about partners. None of our content painted a picture of who those partners were. Partners weren't named, they weren't seen, they weren't visible. They weren't necessarily acknowledged or credited as being thought leaders. We were always the thought leader with the solution. And so there was lots of really, really interesting findings.
Wow, so much. And I'm sure lots of people listening thinking, yeah, that sounds familiar in my own organization, right? What really struck me, Natalie, when you were talking about the process was how this, even though you were using the tools of narrative analysis, it really opened up the wider organizational conversation, like about how do we fundamentally change? Like, how do we live our values? How do we take our progressive stance and make sure we're adding more to this? And for me, I just wondered, like, at what point did you realize this was bigger than an internal communications process, that this is actually fundamentally about organizational shift?
Yeah, it's really interesting because intuitively, I think I had a sense of that, because I had said to colleagues, look, I really don't want to go in and do this narrative analysis with a cold audience. You know, can we get some race and diversity training running first that's got nothing to do with this project? And we did some bite-size training for all staff on racism and diversity, and that was good. That warmed people up a little bit. So I think intuitively I knew, okay, this is bigger than comms. And then I quickly realized that actually we can't do this narrative analysis if we can't have a conversation about white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and we can't, you know, all get on the same page about what systemic racism is within an international setting between countries. And we couldn't really do the work without having a bit of a common language around colonialism and the destruction of knowledge. You know, we work on environmental issues. There's destruction of knowledge that is linked to living with the natural world. So, you know, we did have to set the scene and kind of talk to staff quite a lot about key racism, white supremacy concepts, and particularly those that linked into environmental protection and development sector. So again, there's, you know, intuitively, we were working at an organization culture level before we started, but essentially it was only when I wrote up the findings, I realized actually of all the things that we have done on anti-racism in the Institute over the course of the years, this was just one of a number of things. Most of the other things, like our anti-racist group and the auditing and that type of thing, it was all quite structural and it sat at the surface. Whereas these conversations and this work, for want of a better word, really penetrated into the actual organizational culture. And so it was only when we were really writing up the findings that we realized that maybe comms as an entry point is a really interesting place for getting a bit deeper in terms of people's understanding and their kind of willingness to sit in some of the discomfort that comes when you realize you're kind of reproducing white supremacy in your work on a daily basis, you know, and you know, creating spaces for people to, you know, just reflect on that without having to rush off into solutions straight away. And again, that was a bit of a trigger. It's like, okay, this is culture. We're going a bit deeper.
Yeah. Wow. And maybe if you could just go into a little bit more detail about the process itself. I'm thinking there's a lot of people listening who think like, ooh, this might be something we could do. So
yeah,
a kind of a quick overview of what it looked like in practice.
So the process was literature review. We are a think tank. We felt that having the academic evidence to back up the dimensions of racism we were talking about would be useful. So literature review, and then discussion of all these dimensions of racism that show up in development narratives with staff, and having them kind of input and shape the framework that we were going to use to analyze content, so that they moved along with us, really getting clear on these concepts. What is racism? What's colonialism? What's neo-colonialism? What is what we call epistemicide, you know, destruction of knowledge? Getting clear on all those things conceptually, and then breaking staff down. So we did that with near enough most staff, like 100+ people. And then in small groups of about 8 or 10, staff would volunteer some content to be analysed. And we would use this narrative analysis technique plus the framework, the 6 dimensions, and just discuss and talk through the content for about an hour. And we did, each of the research groups, blogs, strategy. So not just comms pieces, knowledge products, comms pieces and strategic documents. You could have done proposals, you could have done anything essentially. And then we did some feedback sessions with staff. What we also did is we separated out Black staff and staff of colour and white staff in the early all staff sessions, so that there was room for Black staff to share experiences and have a different type of conversation about some of those concepts, because they had different experiences, obviously. So that was the process.
Yeah, wow. And the report comes out in June, you mentioned?
Yeah.
So everybody can watch out for that. One of the things that also hit me as you described the process was how it's one of the trickiest parts of this. And it's one of the ways that often white folks deny it, is to like go up in our heads and talk about the theoretical underpinnings of racism and the intellectualization of racism, and not holding the balance always between the individual choices we make every day and the systemic aspects of racism. And as you described this process, it occurred to me that people could see their own decisions, their own choices, and how they led the work, or whatever piece of the puzzle they had, with the bigger issues that were organizational and societal. And there was a real opportunity to hold the balance there. Does that resonate with you?
It does, and I think some people did that more naturally than others. So some people immediately looked at the framework and were able to quickly say, oh God, I'm reflecting on experiences now. I can see that I've been treated differently. I really remember a staff member saying, I'm paraphrasing, but roughly it was a bit like, oh, so all of that access that I had to all those people, that's actually white privilege and access. And so this idea that actually, as a researcher, for example, people were questioning, oh, am I really, do I have all this knowledge? And that's why I'm doing all this, everybody's listening to me and I have all this authority, or actually are there issues of white privilege and power that give me the authority when I go into those spaces? And I hate to say it's something that is so obvious to so many Black people and people of colour when we work in this sector, and we see the amount of deference that comes when we travel with white colleagues to other countries. But that penny dropped for some people. I think the penny definitely dropped that we invisibilize partners. And I think people definitely realized, it sounds so simple, but just this realization that actually when I interpret data, whether it's focus group data or I'm selecting pictures from a series of photographs, when I interpret that data, I'm retelling a story about myself, rather than what we are led to believe, which is we're telling stories about other people. And that I think is one of the core premises of this work. When we do, write that brief and the report and put the video together, we are telling a story about ourselves as much as anybody else. And the picture that we're painting, when that picture is us as the knowledge keeper going to empower someone else, we're doing that for a reason, and it's about us and how we see our position. So, that in those individual realizations did emerge for some, not for others.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so powerful that we are telling the story of ourselves. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I also find it like it's very moving just to see how personal this process has to be, for us to be able to actually see the spaces that we can make a change, but it has to be like, our own sort of reflection that we're doing for us to get that needle moving. Natalie, you also kept a learning journal to help you, kind of keep track of the personal encounters with racism leading to the project. What did you learn about, from what you were experiencing? What did you learn about, this process also of keeping a learning journal?
Well, this was like this was the hardest bit of this work. Like, I don't know why I decided to do this, but I just thought, well, look, if the theory is that racism is an everyday experience, and I'm about to do a project talking about racism, surely I will, at least see it, if not experience it. I didn't actually think I would experience racism. I thought it would show up and I would observe it in the workplace. And that's initially why I did it. I did have a rude awakening when I actually noticed that I was experiencing racism in some ways as I did this work. And, it was that stark reminder that racism is so ingrained. It can be an everyday experience for Black people and people of color. It was a stark reminder of that, but also that actually when you notice it, particularly then when you write it down and then you talk about it with other people, you do start to unravel it a bit and diffuse it a bit, and it can become, I hate to say more manageable, but well, it's interesting. Actually, I think you can even diffuse it. So when I was doing this work, there was a particular moment where I realized I was in a situation where I had a brainchild. I'd come up with a project. I'd made it happen, got it funded. I was driving this work, and I had found myself in a situation where the work was being discussed and I had no voice and no visibility, like discussed with the whole organization. And I just was gobsmacked. And I thought, how can that happen? And it made me realize that I had a real sense for the first time as a Black woman. I could feel my loss of voice and visibility. I felt very emotional about it in that moment, but it was like a cumulative. It's what I realized. This, when you experience racism and it has a strong feeling, you feel very distressed. Maybe it's because it's an accumulative thing that you might have experienced time and again in small ways, and then there's a bit of a trigger and you feel it all in the moment. But luckily what I was able to do was turn that situation around straight away, because I had my diary and I was looking out for it, I spotted it, and that didn't happen again. Through the course of the project, we were able to readjust everything as we needed to, so that I went back into a position of kind of leading and having voice and visibility on the project that I'd put together for the Institute. And there's one thing I wanted to say at the beginning, and I hope you don't mind me going back to it because it is important, which is that these 6 dimensions, these are not new things. They were written about in the literature, but more importantly, they are things that Black activists and activists of color at a grassroots level have been talking about in all sorts of countries, across countries, within countries for years and years and years. And so this is not necessarily, this is not new, it's not ID that is bringing this to the table. This is work that grassroots activists, or thinking that they have been doing for a long time. And so we just really wanted, we said it a lot in the Institute, but I'm saying it outside as well, it's really important to kind of recognize their struggle and the thinking that's happened way before us.
Yeah. There's some good questions which are coming up also in the chat. And Natalie, someone's asking, could you please repeat the 6 dimensions?
Yeah, so colorblindness, which is all about not seeing race, racism, colonialism, contribution it makes to development, but also not using that language in any way, not recognizing whiteness as also a race and the privilege that comes with it. Saviorism, that idea that we have to save others. what we called the white gaze of development, which was a term phrased by an American academic that works in development. And that's really about modernization theory in a way, you know, this idea that other countries have to be civilized, made civilized and modernized in line with the way that white society sees the world, and a bit of a white world view. So that was the third one. Then we had neutrality, this idea that all countries and people are equal and you can set targets, goals, use rankings like GDP, for example, in a neutral way. But also conversely, that the sector claims to be neutral. You know, you talk a lot about humanitarians saying that we're neutral as a sector, when actually the very act of development and delivery of humanitarian intervention is a very political act in its own right. So there's a kind of double-edged sword around neutrality that can intersect really closely with racism. And then we had what we called a very clunky phrase called West centrism. And what that was really about was recognizing that through development, we really promote the use of Western concepts, and we continue the application of those concepts in other countries where they may make no sense or historically didn't make sense. Things like gender, things like race itself, some of the concepts of organizing justice, economies, even the concept of poverty, you know, that because you don't have a lot of economic wealth, you are lacking, missing, you know, it's still a very kind of capitalist concept. So we had, you know, the promotion of kind of Western concepts abroad. And then lastly, exclusion, this failure to tell the stories that of the work that Black people and people of colour do, whether it's through grassroots movements, through the diaspora, through liberation struggles, that work that they have done to improve health, water and sanitation, education, you know, provide food, all those things that the development sector kind of has taken ownership of, I suppose.
Yeah, and there's two other questions. So Anna Martin, I think she asked, how long did the whole process take, you know, this narrative analysis? And then the second question is, when you mentioned that you realized that you had lost sort of your voice, you know, in the whole process, how did you take your voice back?
Good question. So the process took just over 4 months, and we started in January. Well, I suppose January, February, March, April. Yeah, 4 months to do for the whole process. In terms of getting my voice back, interesting turn of phrase. I kind of want to say I never fully lost it. I think what happened was I got caught in there was a moment where I could see if I allowed the situation to continue, it would spiral. And I kind of said, you know what, it was to do with the division of labor. So because a short version, because to get this funded, we did it as an internal evaluation, which meant that we brought in some consultants because we needed a little bit of independence. And so the way we had divided up the work with that consultants didn't work in that moment. And so what I had to do was just notice that and talk to everybody about it and reconfigure how we were going to work together. But what it does speak to is that actually anti-racist work is not well funded and it's not seen as a priority. And I had to beg, borrow and steal to get the funding for the project to go ahead, which meant making compromises in how it was conceived and framed and bringing in people when that probably wasn't actually exactly what we needed or how I'd wanted to do it, even though it all worked out really well in the end, and particularly because the people we were working with were such fantastic anti-racists and they understood immediately how actually that situation for me kind of not having voice and visibility had its roots in systemic racism because of how we'd had to fund the piece, and they understood very quickly and we rejigged things, and that I was able to talk to the Institute about how systemic racism literally played out in the putting together of the work. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. I mean, there's quite a number of other questions, you know, as what you're also mentioning right now sort of touches also on the privilege that, you know, institutions such as the IAD would also have to hire, you know, experts who can kind of guide them in the process. And you have sometimes the smaller organizations who want to kind of go through the same process, but they're not able to delve into that, but because of funding. But I think, Jennifer, maybe we can move to the breakout sessions.
Well, I'm going to propose, we already have so many questions coming in and people wanting to engage with Natalie. So I propose we skip small groups this time, also because we have a very big group this time, and just use our remaining minutes on the hour to, it's gone fast. It always does. Our hour always goes fast. So why don't I turn to a next question from Kamna, who's come in. She's curious about how you brought your colleagues into the journey. What was difficult? Did you face any resistance internally?
Yeah, I think that the moment, you know, we've all been in this moment where we've seen this big resurgence in Black activisms with BLM. And I think that paved the way. We weren't able to, you know, I didn't face much resistance. I think the resistance that came was much more when we were doing some of the analysis, you know, as the discomfort would set in with people that actually, we are reproducing racism, there was this desire to move on quickly. You know, what are the solutions, and to want to solve straight away. So there was a resistance to really sit with what we were finding, allow it to settle so that we could really think about lasting systemic solutions, because there are systemic problems. But so the resistance was this need to think very quickly and at quite a superficial level and come up with small fixes. We had resistance in that. There was actually a struggle, I think, for people to get their heads around the fact that reproducing racism is not the sole domain of white people, and that actually Black people and people of colour and Indigenous leaders and groups can and do reproduce racism because it is so internalized and powerful. And so, you know, there was some resistance to that there, I think, because sometimes we romanticize some of the people that we work with, and it was hard maybe sometimes for people to think that some of our partners would actually be complicit in reproducing racism. So there were bits of resistance there. But on the whole, the Institute have been so open. We've had very dynamic and constructive conversations. A whole raft of staff have been given permission to be themselves and say what they really think about these issues in the Institute. So many people are now really expecting the Institute to deliver on some significant transformational change around partner relationships, around how we communicate, around addressing white supremacy in our culture. You know, it's a bit like people were waiting for something like this to happen.
Yeah, and Natalie, you said that there even was this like little cohort of really progressive folks who came and wanted to support the process. And that was kind of even a surprise for you, because they had, again, permission to kind of really get in it and across many teams. So, you know, how did you fuel those people that are so ready and are sometimes the enthusiasm of the activism can be a little overwhelming too?
I think we've had synchronicity. We've been blessed with good timing. So when by chance, as I was writing up the findings for this, our executive director was thinking about organizational culture for lots of different reasons. We're in COVID, there's the funding situation in the sector, there's lots of things happening. And so I think, at least I hope there will be an opportunity to look at white supremacy and racism within any broader discussions around organizational culture and any changes that we need to usher in, or the senior management needs to usher in, as we adapt and pivot in this kind of post-COVID world. And so now racism and white supremacy has been folded into the discussion on any pivoting and changing that needs to happen. So that, you say good timing, but I just think that, I don't know, I'm a bit of a hippie. There's something about how COVID and the anti-racist movement all happening at the same time. There's something in that. I don't quite know what it is. But yeah, I think that there's just lots of energy, and people, there'll be offshoots. People go off and do their own thing, as well as the organization convening some more structured things. And in comms will chip away with some next steps around this piece of work.
Hannah is asking if you could share a little bit more about how neutrality basically showed up in your analysis. Lots of politeness, not wanting to rock the boat culture, where she works.
Okay. For us, it was anchored around our use of data. We're a think tank. We use a lot of data, and we definitely kind of underpin a lot of our work with statistics that are based around rankings, even that are based on the idea of neutrality. So a lot of the rankings we use, we've had to ask questions about that and what they mean and what our use of them means. We obviously link lots of our work to things like the SDGs, international targets that have been set with the idea of universality, which is brilliant. On one hand, they apply to everybody, and universality is a real game changer. It helps tackle saviorism and tackle the modernization theory. So on that hand, I personally think they're excellent. But on the other hand, we have set those targets as if all countries are equal, when we know they are not. So generally, our use of data is kind of something that we just really need to think about. And across the board, our use of data, our use of language, our framings, all of the things that have emerged as areas where we would want to see some transformation are going to be really hard changes to make, because there is a common language in the sector. And changing that is tricky. All those targets and rankings are common. You can't just stop using them. The word development is problematic. Are we going to just stop using it? And so what we're thinking about is like positionality. How do we frame? Because actually how you frame things is something that you can do and change. And how the historical context that we set our work in is something that we can do. So there are some things that are longer term shifts that we know the sector will have to pick up collectively, and there are some things that we know as an institute we can start to work on.
Yeah, thanks. A question from Ella. Did you ever feel that the research process stayed too much in people's heads? Because and the background is, of course, we know that the experience of racism, exclusion is like in our bodies.
Yeah.
How did staying with the discomfort, how did that work out in this process?
I'm absolutely sure we were all too much in our heads, myself included, because it's in the title, we're a think tank. So, that was just always going to be the case. But how we get a bit more embodied with it is a good question, particularly when we had to do it all digitally, like that, just didn't help. you know, one thing we did do was really encourage people to do some of their unlearning around racism alongside what's happening in the Institute. But yeah, I'm sure it was all a bit heady.
And that's a tough balance in our professional workspaces. Right? But yeah, we're building our capacity all the time to sit with other people's experiences. We hope. We hope. There is so we're 3 minutes before the end of the time. We always extend because it's always too juicy to end. So those of you who have to run, we totally understand. Thank you for being here. We just want to take a moment and acknowledge everyone's presence for this hour, and share a little bit about the next session. We do this every month, and on the second Wednesday. That next month is June 9th. You're all welcome. You're also welcome to share suggestions you have for upcoming guests, and just glad you're here. So if you have to run, thanks for being here. And before they go, Natalie, will you tell them where to find the report, where it's going to be made available, what
Yeah.
everybody
So it will be on the IIED website, iied.org, and it should be coming out in June. But you can also, if you follow either me or IIED on Twitter, it will be shared on Twitter as well.
Great. We'll put your link in the chat here for everybody. Yeah.
There's a practical question. This is actually related to what I was also burning to ask. It's from Gift Sally of HiVos, and she's asking, how are you using internal communications to champion the anti-racism narrative? Are there any tools or tactics that you can share?
There's a couple of things we've done. So I mentioned that we had to lay foundations internally before we could even run this project. So we did that, the bite-sized trainings for staff. We set up an anti-racist working group. And so what we did as an anti-racist working group is we did an internal kind of talk piece on racism within the actual institute. So people spoke in pairs, in small groups, in teams, as a whole institute. And we talked about racism in the Institute in particular. That was actually the first thing we did. The bite-sized training came on top of that. We used internal comms. So we have someone in charge of our internal comms. We put together a big resource list of all the things that you could read and listen to and watch to help you start to understand racism and unlearn racism. We used our staff meetings to talk about the work that anti-racist working group was doing, but also to encourage staff to sign up and be part of the narrative analysis evaluation. And we use staff meetings to share the initial framework and discuss it, and then to share the findings. So we've used the kind of just the day-to-day internal comms of staff meetings and also staff newsletters. Like everything's been in all the staff newsletters. So the entire project has gone through the internal comms machinery.
And in terms of also the external communications work of comms, are there some practices, or are there some tools that you're also implementing, or the people who are still part of our session today can take away with them?
We will produce something. We're not quite at that stage yet because we're writing up the findings. It is a real balance. You do a project like this, on one hand, the sense is that you would love to be able to give people some tools and guidelines on how to write differently, how to create content differently. But actually, is it about just writing and creating content differently? Not really. It is, but it isn't. It is about cultural change and organizational change. So we've kind of gone into that space first, and I think we will circle back and also at some point think about the type of guidelines maybe that we could produce for staff. The main thing we're saying to staff is, if you haven't had content analysed through the process, book a session, and we'll just keep doing content analysis with staff. And people that have done it, we're saying book a session, and we will test and experiment with rewriting content internally, just between us, like having the 6 dimensions, knowing what we know. You know, what would you write differently? I started writing differently, you know, just from doing this work.
Yeah, essentially, your comms department developed a new offering that wasn't just about pushing out, but like leading analysis. That's now a function of your communications team, as I understand it. That was
well
before, but this is now expressly part of the work, right?
As long as we can keep the funding, even funding to do that. Like most of our posts are funded to do certain jobs that are really part of the end of pipe content production process. So to actually fund staff to do this internally focused work is not straightforward, and we will be, you know, we're working with it, and nothing's stopped yet, but nothing, you know, it's not a total given either that we can really establish that permanently, for example.
But hopefully everyone here is nodding that this can be, this is something we've got to think about how to build into our budgets and our communication budgets, so that this is a service essentially that we who are looking at the external audience all day can say to the people inside the organization, if we put it out that way, we're reinforcing X, Y, Z, right? And be able to interrupt that when we, because so much of it, especially I've done publication production, so much of it is already cooked by the time it would get to me, right? And it's already gone through research boards, and then it's like, oh, you know, so I think comms folks often feel stuck there. So it is about kind of reimagining our function and what we're here to do. And that you're right, the toolkits are great, but we're talking about worldview. We're talking about shifting an entire sector away from all the dimensions you talked about. So, Natalie, will you stay with us for one more question?
Yeah, for sure.
Anybody have others? We have a few more. We have still about 20 people here. Just wondering, what's your advice for anyone starting out in this process or who wants to do something similar?
Definitely lay the groundwork. You know, if you can't have a comfortable enough conversation about things like white supremacy, racism, colonial legacy and empire, anti-blackness, if you can't use that language and kind of it with the bulk of your staff, then it's going to be really hard to make gains with a project like this. So I think laying the foundations, warming up your workforce so that muscle of talking about race and racism has been given a little bit of a run and it has been exercised. Then also making sure people have a common enough language and understanding about those core concepts, then I think you know, you'll have a richer experience doing the work. You'll be able to uncover much more because people will, you know, they'll have the language to do the analysis, and they'll have the confidence that they can speak out, you know, and name these things as they are seeing them.
Shared vocabulary is a great start, even if it feels like not enough.
And Natalie, you also mentioned that you worked with some consultants, because Anna Martin is asking, you know, can you confirm if you worked with external consultants, and how was that hiring process and the relationship?
Yeah, so we commissioned an academic to do the literature review and to do some co-facilitation with us. And she brought in a co-facilitator because we actually had, quite a lot of people that wanted to do this work. And, the academic, her name was Lara, and she was literally a beacon of anti-racist light. She really had an inspirational and a committed understanding of anti-racism, and kind of held that for the institute, standing at the front, sometimes on her own, sometimes with others, and being quite immovable on the fundamentals. And that really created space.
Wonderful.
Here's to immovable consultants. Oh, any other questions before we wrap up? Thanks for staying with us, those who've hung on. We'll just stop and thank you, Natalie, for being here, for visibilizing your own learning, for telling us about the nuts and bolts, for getting into the practicalities, which is what we're here to do, and to help us just keep expanding our notion of how this new world can be born. And we have to do it together. So thanks for being here. And I'll hand to Joan.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie, so much. I can see there's a lot of, need for these kind of conversations with someone like you. So we're so grateful that, we could do this together with you today. And yeah, Natalie is reachable on Twitter. So yeah, a lot of the messages and also the reports that she's working on is going to be coming out soon enough. And Jennifer and I are also going to be keeping an eye out. And let's continue on this journey together. Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie, for also shining the light, illuminating this path so that we're able to have more clarity in terms of the steps we can take in our organizations and also in our work that we're doing. Yeah, as comms, as programs. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. It's lovely to share and to listen and to be heard, all those things. So thank you.
Yeah.